Hi, welcome to A Gray Barn Rising. I'm sitting here this evening reading the poetry of George Oppen. George Oppen lived from 1908 to 1984. He's a marvelous poet who is normally considered an objectivist, and the objectivists were a group of poets in the modernist tradition. They were connected to Ezra Pound and Imagism. And like the Imagists, they really felt that they wanted a direct treatment of a kind of reality. For the Imagists, it was a direct treatment of the image. For the Objectivists, it was really a direct treatment of the object. Admittedly, objectivism is difficult to nail down sometimes when you look at objectivists' poems. What is an objectivist poem? What is not an objectivist poem? But what objectivism really does share is that across poems and across the poets associated with the objectivist movement is a poem that aims for great clarity, great sincerity, looking at and a perception of the object as something that they don't want the consciousness of the poet to interfere with in some way and to contaminate through the poet's perception, but to try to present that object with the greatest clarity possible. What I admire about the poetry of George Oppen and his objectivism is primarily his associations, diversions. The poem is continually undoing itself as it aims for that clarity. There's syntactical slippages, gaps in the discourse, starts and stops that are really interesting in very powerful ways. So I thought I would share some of George Oppen's poems with you this evening, and I wanted to begin, I'm going to read through a variety of books, and I wanted to begin by reading from the new collected poems of George Oppen, and I wanted to share a couple of poems that had previously not been published until they appeared in the new collected poems. But first I want to begin with an older poem of his that had been published. And this is a poem called The Crowded Countries of the Bomb. You're going to hear a lot of political references in George Oppen's work as well, and I'll speak about that in a moment. The crowded countries of the bomb. What man could do and could not, and chance which has spared us, choice which has shielded us, as if a god. What is the name of that place we have entered? Despair? Ourselves? That we can destroy ourselves now, walking in the shelter, the young and the old, of each other's backs and shoulders, entering the country that is impenetrably ours. I mentioned Oppen's, the political nature of some of his poems. He was very politically active. He began writing and publishing in the early 1930s. And he was politically active, was a communist, and actually, very oddly, moved his focus away from poetry for a quarter century, at least 25 years, and did not write poetry and did not publish, and moved his focus more into politics. In fact, he became so concerned with the ramifications of his political activities that in the 1950s he moved to Mexico with his wife Mary for something like 8 years. I believe they left this country in 1950 and didn't return until 1958. He wanted to escape the House Un-American Activities Committee and didn't want to testify in front of McCarthy and Martin Dies and people like that. So he returned and began writing again in 1958 or so. So I'd like to read another poem of his, certainly not an overtly political poem. This poem does not have a title. This is a previously unpublished poem. It just has brackets, so I think Oppen was probably uncertain about the title at the time. And in brackets it's called Bill Before His Death. I believe this is a poem about William Carlos Williams. Certainly the references in the book and the poem suggest that. Bill before his death. Bill before his death, Bill very old, still like a boy, but a boy whom an axe has hit again and again in the dark, in the last months, an arm stiff, a leg dragging, his speech impeded. You cannot imagine, he said, what has been happening to me. One of the interesting books of George Oppen is called Seascape Needle's Eye. Sumac Press, the publishers of Sumac Press were Jim Harrison and Dan Gerber. They brought this book out many years ago. And I want to read just a line from this poem to set up the next poem that I want to read. This is from the Oppen's group of poems entitled Some San Francisco Poems. And this is the closing line of section 10. And section 10 is entitled But So As By Fire. And the closing line is, summon one's powers. Summon one's powers. It's a directive that comes at the end of the poem that's very powerful and speaks to me across texts. I've always loved that section of the poem, and I would encourage you to read the entire poem. But it really sets up for me this poem that I want to read for you now, a previously unpublished poem called The Powers. I mentioned, I believe, that Oppen was born into a Jewish family, and he often references his heritage in some powerful ways, as he does in this poem. The Powers. I would go home, oh, go home to the rough stone, become the turn, the cadence, the verse and the music, the essential, clarity. Plain glass, strangest of all places, strange as all places, strange as chance, strange as luck, and its guilt's strange, strange, and the slang word speaks in the whirlwinds, Semite, to find a way for myself now, old, strange to happen, to a child, strange to become old, the innocence of the insulted in the challenged blood of childhood, now patriarchal, Jew most strange to myself, not Roman nor barbarian. Had I foreseen this, the words themselves or their strangeness, strange, the saving ray of strangeness, saving ray of exile, ray of darkness, ray of light. I just adore the repetition in that poem and the strange way that the word strange keeps reappearing in that poem. Speaking of strange, here's an odd little poem called The Dream, also from previously unpublished poems gathered in the collected. The Dream. I dreamed one night that I was in northern France in one of the red brick industrial towns, the doors and the windows locked. I knocked on a door and entered, and I said to the family, I was here during the war. I was in a house near here, though I cannot find it. It is near. You can take me there. They will know me. I stood in that room, and they would not guide me. I was lost, and they could not guide me. I love that, the oddity and the strangeness of that fragment from a dream. Oppen paid attention to his dreams. when he was not writing, when he lived in Mexico, he had this dream, interestingly, and he found himself looking at his father's files in the dream, and there was one labeled, I want to get this correct for you, how to prevent rust in copper. And he mentioned this to his analyst at the time, and he knew that copper doesn't rust. And the analyst said basically that in hearing the dream, this therapist thought that it was in reference to Oppen, that if he didn't pick up writing again, that he himself would rust. And so he went home and he began writing fervently after that. I want to move now to my very favorite book of George Oppen's, and that is the book entitled Primitive. This was his last published book before he left the body. And Primitive was actually, I came, I guess, backwards to George Oppen. This was the very first book of George Oppen that I ever read. This is how I discovered him. I discovered him because the book was reasonably priced when I found it in a bookstore in the summer of 1980. And I didn't know who George Oppen was, and the poems just began to blow me away as I read them. And then I backtracked and read earlier Oppen poems after this. So I want to give you two of these. This is called Gold on Oak Leaves. Gold said her golden young poem, for she sleeps, and impossible truths move brave through the gold, the living veins, but for the gold light I am lost, in the gold light on this salt and sleepless sea I haunt an old ship. The sun glints through ragged caulking. I would go out past the axioms of wandering. Timbers, garboards, keelson, the keel, full depth of the ship, in that light into all that never knew me alone. In the sea, fellow me feminine, winds as you pass. I mentioned earlier how the syntax often shifts in a George Oppen poem, and sometimes you're disoriented, wondering which phrase goes with which phrase, and that's part of his undoing of the poem and trying to get multiple readings of the poem simultaneously. I'd like to close with one of my very favorite George Oppen poems, also from Primitive, and it's called Disasters. And you're going to notice again some of those syntactic slippages and those movements where one phrase goes with another partially, but then it moves forward into the next phrase. It's just brilliant in that regard. Disasters. Of wars, O western wind and storm, of politics, I am sick with a poet's vanity. Legislators of the unacknowledged world, it is dreary to descend and be a stranger. How shall we descend, who have become strangers in this wind that rises like a gift in the disorder, the gales of a poet's vanity, if our story shall end, untold to whom and to what are we ancestral? We wanted to know if we were any good out there. The song changes, the wind has blown the sand about, and we are alone. The sea dawns in the sunrise verse with its rough beach light, crystal extreme. Sands dazzling under the near and not less brutal feet, journey in light and wind and fire and water and air, the five bright elements, the marvel of the obvious and the marvel of the hidden is there. In fact, a distinction dance of the wasp wings dance as of the mother tongues? Can they, with all their meanings, dance? Oh, oh, I see my love. I see her go over the ice alone. I see myself, Sarah, Sarah. I see the tent in the desert. My life narrows. My life is another. I see him in the desert. I watch him. He is clumsy and alone. My young brother. He is my lost sister. Her small voice among the people. The salt and terrible hills whose armies have marched, and the caves of the hidden people. The velocity of that poem and the music of that poem always ends up just carrying me away. It's one of the great things about poetry is that sometimes the precise meanings or explicit meanings of a poem or their words may feel elusive to us, but there's this other side to a poem, certainly in that poem, where the music has a deep and profound meaning and an impact on our viscera and our nervous systems, as that poem certainly has on me. So those are a few of the poems of George Oppen. I read from, as I mentioned, Primitive, the amazing book Primitive, and also I read from the new collected poems of George Oppen. I've read several poems, including some that were previously unpublished, and I read a line from George Oppen's book from Sumac Press, Seascape, Needle's Eye. Thank you so much for joining Bootsy and me for another episode of A Gray Barn